Hi, I'm Pastor Andrew Prairie from Prairie Alliance Church. Welcome to our YouTube channel today. As you engage with this sermon, I pray that the God who loves you would meet with you in meaningful and significant ways. I want to encourage you to lean in to the extent possible, with a heart posture that's open to receiving from God whatever it is that He wants to say to you or do in your life today. As a church, we care about you. We want to continue to see you flourish and thrive. And so we'd love to receive you in person at the church campus whenever you'd like to come, but also feel free to engage with us here on our YouTube channel or on our website at gpalliance.ca.
Welcome here. For those of you that are joining us online, we welcome you as well. Have you ever walked into a room that you're really familiar with, only to get the sense that something's different? The people might be the same. Furniture might even look the same, but you've got this deep sense that something's changed. And I don't know about you, but when I walk into a situation like that, the first question that comes to my mind is, what is going on here? Now, I'm sure all of us as individuals can understand that feeling, but I want to argue today that we, as a congregation, are also experiencing that change. Consider in 2021, the average attendance here was roughly 613 people. Today, the average attendance is over 1,400. The room has definitely changed. God is entrusting us with growth, but growth requires change. It requires that the room is changed. It also requires something else of us. It requires us to make space. It requires us to kind of give up on some of our own expectations. And perhaps it even requires us to be a bit uncomfortable. I really appreciated the reflective moment that Pastor Caleb led us in last weekend. It was an intentional moment to sit and to reflect and to pray and to just be in God's presence as we consider what has happened over the past few weeks for our congregation. But also, I would argue that some of us, those changes happened a long time ago. And this is where 2 Kings 2 brings us. This is a moment of transition. Elijah is leaving and Elisha is stepping forward. But it's not just about leadership change. Today, we're going to be looking at the way that God leads His people through transition. Now, Pastor Andrew talked about individual change and individual transition. Today, we're going to be focusing more on a congregation and us as a group. How do we navigate what is happening in our midst when we know the room has changed? As we look at this passage, we can see a pattern of three. We see three locations. We see three invitations to stay. And we see three responses of faithfulness. Now, interestingly enough, in the Hebrew and Jewish culture, the number 3 means completeness. It means taking two opposing ideas and bringing them together as a unified whole. Today's scripture brings two tensions together. It's honoring what God has done without resisting what God is doing, and bringing those together in faithful continuity. So let's dive in. We're looking at 2 Kings chapter 2. If you have a Bible or the Bible app, I invite you to join with me, and it'll be on the screen as well. So 2 Kings chapter 2, starting at verse 1. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied, "but don't speak about it." Then Elijah said to him, "Elisha, the Lord has sent me to Jericho." And I'll continue on. The pattern repeats itself 2 more times. Now, this journey from Gilgal through Bethel, through Jericho to Jordan, it could just seem like this logistical journey that Elijah knows his time is coming, so he's going to touch base one more time. It would make sense. But I think it's more than that. These places are not random. They retrace the foundations of Israel's story. Gilgal carries the sense of beginnings, covenant renewal, and separation from the old life. In Israel's story, it marked the place of entering the land and leaving the wilderness identity. And for Elisha and Elijah, Gilgal sets the tone for the entire journey. Before inheritance, you must surrender. Bethel means house of God, so it naturally invokes encounter, revelation, and divine presence. It carries this idea of sacred remembrance and divine promise. Jericho, of course, reminds us of obstacles and conflict and God's power to lead his people through resistance. But why do these 3 matter? It's as though God is retracing Israel's story before taking them forward again. And that is often what happens in our lives. God reminds us of our foundations before he moves us forward. Now, not only do we see 3 locations, but we see 3 replies. Elijah says, "Stay here." We see Elisha's reply. He says, "Not a chance." But doesn't that sound weird? If you remember back to when Pastor Andrew was speaking, Elijah was the one that approached Elisha. He stood at the end of the field, and there was this whole thing about the oxen and the hairy coat and the calling of Elisha. So why would Elijah try to convince Elisha to not follow him? It doesn't make any sense. The repeated command is less about Elijah trying to lose Elisha. It's more about exposing Elisha's resolve. Each "stay here" in effect says, will you stop at the threshold, or will you keep following the next step that requires trust? Now, we could read this, we could focus solely on Elisha, we could treat this story as one man's determination, but this is not just about personal loyalty. This is about God forming in and for his people the things that he needs us to have when we walk through seasons of change. So Elisha's determination to stay connected to Elijah can teach us something. God forms a people who remain united through transition. When transition becomes obvious, the room starts to feel a little bit different. Growth stretches us. When leadership shifts and when expectations change, God's not only moving his mission forward, he is shaping how we as the church walk together. So what does this mean for us here in Grand Prairie Alliance Church in this season of transition? Because even though the last 5 years we've seen incredible growth, I would argue, church, that we're at the precipice of another transition. God is calling this church, each one of us, united together into new spaces and new opportunities. So as a congregation, we must determine to stay present with one another. We must commit to the work that God has called us to. And we must stay aligned with his mission, even if we fully don't understand the why and the timing. For Elisha, each step of the journey, there was an opportunity to stop. Each place represented the same question: will you stop where it feels comfortable? We've seen the notes in General Assembly talking about staying or being comfortable or asking God to move us outside of that. So will you stop where it feels comfortable, or will you continue where God is leading? The same questions come to us, because there's always moments when it would be easier to step back, when things feel a little bit unfamiliar, when the pace changes, when systems grow and change, when people we know or rhythms we love begin to shift. But faithfulness for a church is not measured in comfort. It's measured by whether we continue walking together in obedience. I want to highlight a couple other individuals in this story. We see in this passage prophets, and they're the ones that are saying to Elisha, hey, don't you understand? Like, your master's going, shouldn't you be upset? And Elisha's reply is basically, be quiet. Elisha's be quiet is not rude indifference. It's the posture of a man who knows God is doing something painful, holy, and unavoidable. Sometimes faith doesn't mean talking more about hard truth. It means submitting to the hard truth with reverence, and it means staying faithful through the process. Elisha's silence is the silence of trust. It's one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity in this passage. When change becomes obvious, Elisha does not resist the moment. He stays faithful in it. So how does that connect to us? Well, as we've discussed, we've experienced a tremendous amount of growth. There's a lot of change in the room. The truth about change, though, is you can't predict it, can't stop it, and you can't always understand it. And for us, that matters, because in seasons like this, it would be easier to talk more than trust. It could be easier to analyze the way things are more than to accept them and to step out in obedience. And it could be easier to let uncertainty become a distraction. And I can attest to many of these in my own life as God led us into seasons and moments of transition where I would analyze, because of my personality, I would just analyze things to death. And I would get completely distracted instead of just embracing and saying, Lord, my answer is yes. We must determine that we're not going to be that kind of church. Instead, we'll be a people who move through transition with trust, with unity, and with a quiet confidence that God is truly at work. What does staying close as a church look like? It means staying committed to gathering, even when the room feels different. It means staying aligned with mission, not personal preference. It means staying engaged in what God is doing, even while it is still taking shape and we don't even understand where we may be going. And we step out in obedience, and we determine to stay close to the moving of the Spirit. You know, sometimes a family will move into a bigger house. The rooms are larger, the layout is different, and at first it's disconcerting. It feels unfamiliar. But here's the point. The family has not lost itself. It's still present. It's simply learning a larger space. In church today, we're at a point where we're learning and constantly learning a larger space. Let's look at the next section, 2 Kings 2, 7 to 14. So the first couple of sentences, we see these prophets are standing, they're observing, they're watching. Verse 8, we see Elijah rolls up his mantle, hits the Jordan, crosses over. And then we see this conversation in verse 9. When they crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replies. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, not." So then we see in verse 11, the chariot and fire and horses of fire appear. Elijah is gone. Elisha sees this, but all of a sudden, the mantle drops. In verse 13, he picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak from that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided right and to the left, and he crossed over. There's so many things of symbolism in here, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. The Jordan came to symbolize that boundary between receiving the promise and fulfilling the promise. It wasn't just a river. To the people of Israel, it represented moving from one stage of life and entering another. But I want to draw your attention to what happened at the Jordan, and this is really exciting. The writer does not look at the Jordan and record it in both Elijah and Elisha's incident. He does not just say, the water just split and they walked across dry ground. No, he's very specific. He says the water split from left to right. It was a controlled division. It was a controlled separation in the middle of chaos. And it was a God-directed order. This shows us that no matter what chaos we find ourselves in, that God always rules the chaos and he always leads his servants through it if we choose to follow. Church, in our history, there's been so many Jordans, so many thresholds of transition, and each time the church has stepped forward, and because you have, the fruit of faithfulness is now clearly evident in the growth that we are experiencing. But I would argue in our current context, we also find ourselves at another Jordan, another transition. And what are we going to do with it? In verse 9 and 10, we see the discussion about the cloak falling and Elisha's picking it up. And a couple of things to notice here, too, is that the mantle falls. Well, first there was horses of fire and chariots of fire, and I'm so thankful that my own personal transitions have not included chariots and horses of fire. I'm really grateful because I don't know if I would have the stomach to continue. But we see here that Elijah's cloak falls. Elisha doesn't pick it up right away. It says he rips his garments and then he picks it up. Now, why is this important? The cloak, or the mantle as it's called in other passages, marked prophetic authority. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It signaled succession. But more importantly, it represented the continuity of God's activity and work from one generation to the next. Elisha's response after it falls, he tears his garment, and this is a sign of grief, but it's also a sign of surrender, because by doing that, Elisha has told us and has illustrated for us that he's not going to drag the past into the future. he simply reaches down, picks up the cloak, and receives what God has for him in the next step. The Jordan is a threshold. Thresholds were never meant to camp on. They're something to cross. And that matters for us. As transitions have happened over the years, we cannot live as though the current season is the same as the last one. God calls us into new rhythms, new structures, new responsibilities, and it will feel uncomfortable, but that does not mean that God is absent. The Jordan is a threshold where a church leaves one season behind and steps together in what comes next. So, church, as we journey together, I'm absolutely confident that there's going to be more transitions. We're going to come up to this moment of Jordans, and we're going to have to decide, are we going to step over and into, or are we going to step back and avoid? Remember, the Jordan represented to the Hebrew people the difference between receiving the promise and fulfillment of it. As we move to the third part of the story, it's the response of the 50 prophets that are standing and watching this whole thing. In 2 Kings, again, chapter 2, and we'll start at verse 15 to 18. It says, "The company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, 'The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha.'" So they acknowledge it. They can see it. They've seen the evidence that there's been this continuity, and they embrace it. And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. "Look," they said, "we, your servants, have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on a mountain or in some valley." "No," Elisha replied, "do not send them." But they persisted until he was too ashamed to refuse. Now, that's an interesting passage in itself, and we could unpack so much more there, but imagine having somebody persist. They've just said, "Hey, we recognize you're Elijah's successor, but we need to go and check things out and see where Elijah is." They persisted until he was too ashamed to refuse, so he said, "Send them." And they sent 50 men who searched for 3 days, but did not find him. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, "Didn't I tell you not to go?" This is such a human response by that group of 50. Because when something familiar is gone, even if we know God is present, even if we can witness the continuity of God, part of us in our humanness wants to go looking for what used to be. We want to recover the voice, the rhythm, the structure, the arrangement, because it makes us feel secure. And I want us to notice this carefully. The prophets are not responding out of rebellion. They're not rejecting God. They're grieving. They're confused, and they're trying to make sense of this holy transition. But Elisha had already crossed the Jordan again. The mantle had already fallen. The evidence of God's continuing work was already in front of them. And still, they said, "Let's go and search." And church, this is where the passage presses us hard. It is possible to believe God is leading and still spend way too much energy trying to get back to what was. We can do that in churches as congregations. We can do that in our families. We can even do it within ourselves and our own hearts. We say, yes, God is at work, but part of us still is searching for that old equilibrium, the old comfort, the old clarity, the old way the room used to feel. But the invitation of this passage is not about forgetting Elijah. It's not to dishonor the past, and it is not to pretend that there is no grief. The invitation is to recognize where God's Spirit is resting right now and to follow him forward with trust. Also, earlier you would have noticed that Elisha had asked for a double portion. This wasn't about status. This was about capacity. He knows the work is going to continue. He knows that he's going to pick up the mantle and carry on the work of Elijah, but he knows that he will need God's power to carry it. And that's a good prayer for us today. God, give me a double portion. Increase my capacity to embrace the way the room is changing. And here's a reassurance. God does not enlarge his work and then leave his people unequipped. He stretches us. He sustains us. But he is calling us forward. And he is also providing what we need. God calls his people to stop searching for the old arrangement and to step into the future that he has for us. Today, to the leaders in the room, I want to encourage you to lead with patience, clarity, and humility. Growth can bring pressure, but it is never a reason to become harsh or hurried. Help people understand where God is leading and shepherd them through transition with steadiness and grace. To those of you that have been part of the journey all these years, thank you. You are part of the story that brought this church to this moment in time. Your faithfulness, your wisdom, and your steadiness are gifts to the whole body. As we give thanks for what God has built, we also remember that faithfulness is not only preserving what we have known, but sometimes it's helping carry what God is forming next. To our long-time attenders, you are not being asked to forget the past. You're being invited to help carry the future. And then to those of you that maybe find yourselves, you're relatively new to Grand Prairie Alliance Church, I want to say a wholehearted welcome. You are not outsiders to this church's mission. You are being invited into a story that God began long before you ever arrived. Receive the story with gratitude. Learn its rhythms. Honor those who came before you and help strengthen what God is building right now. So, church, how are we to proceed? We must determine that we will be a church that believes that God is faithful and continues to empower throughout transition. We must determine that we are a church that believes that the growth is not something to fear. We must determine that we will be a church that believes that the Spirit is still at work. And we must determine that we will be a church that believes that trust and not resistance defines us. The question before us as a church is not how do we get back to the way things were, or how do we even carry the things forward, but it's how we will faithfully follow God together in this season. This story of Elijah and Elisha shows us that transition is not just about loss, but it's opportunity. It's an opportunity to trust, grow, and experience all that God has for us. We will experience pain. The room will feel uncomfortable, and we may even feel unsettled. Or if you're like me, you kind of get excited when things start shaking things up. But even in the midst, Elisha's story calls us deeply to honor the past, receive the present, but wholeheartedly step across the threshold into what God has planned for us.